Polish gap, the Bessarabian gap, those are two of the biggest ones. And they are, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, on the far side of Ukraine from Russia. So Putin's end goal here is to plug all 9 of these gaps. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russians went from controlling all 9 to just 1. And bit by bit, with the Kazakh conflict, with Nagorno-Karabakh, with the Georgia War, with the Crimean War, they've added bits and pieces back to plugging those gateways. And if they get Ukraine in its totality, they will have merely plugged another 2. Now, that does mean that Ukraine is not the end of the story. It's just the middle of the story. There's another war after this one. Sure. So the geography explains the why. The why now is demographics. The Russians, well, I don't know if you've ever been to Russia, the climate is awful, and it's very difficult in a modern society to function because you don't have rivers going the right directions. The winters are long and they're harsh. And so civilization in the way that we think of it is very expensive, and they don't have any natural ways to generate capital on their own. So it's always been a very brute force approach, and it took Stalin to industrialize what was then the Soviet Union. But that has a consequence. As you move people off of the farms and into cities, kids go from being free labor to just being mobile, loud, expensive pieces of furniture. And you have less of them because adults can do math. So Russia in 2 generations went from having 7 children per family to now under 2. And that was before the bottom fell out in the post-Soviet collapse. And they're now down to about 1.4. The generation that collapsed in the 1990s is now so small that when it's their turn to have kids, there's not a whole lot that can happen. So this is kind of the last year that the Russians have a large enough cadre of people in their 20s to have a draft-based military. You wait any longer than this, and the Russians are going to have difficulties patrolling their own internal territories, much less fighting off any external aggressor. So while no one's expecting a war in the short term of somebody invading Russia, the Russians know that if they don't do this now, that no matter what the power balances are in the future, they will always be on the losing side. Russia's never been like that. Russia borders a dozen different countries, all of which have taken a crack at Russia at some point in the past. And hypersonics sound great until you realize that unless you put a nuke on the end of that, all you've done is blown up a building. And it's a very expensive way to blow up a building. So hypersonics really serve very little purpose in a conventional war. Jets do, and Russia's military reflects that. When you've got a large chunk of territory and you expect to be the defender, you have bottomless supplies of cheap disposable disposable jets. And to this point, there's no one on their borders who can match that. But the Germans are no slacks. The Swedes always punch above their weight. The Poles have a historical grudge to bear. The Iranians and the Turks have never been Russian friends. The Chinese almost got in a nuclear war with the Japanese in the past, and the Russians are still smarting over their war with Tokyo back in 1905. So from the Russian point of view, there is no horizon that is safe. And the hypersonics just aren't the weapon systems to balance that. The only reason that the Russians have done hypersonics is their logic is if it works, then we have the ability to strike the North American continent in a very short period of time. I would argue, though, that what we've seen out of the Russian systems does not look all that promising for no other reason than either the Trump or the Biden administrations hasn't pushed for a new round of nuclear arms talks because as soon as they started working on hypersonics, we started working on hypersonics. And that was a program here that we shelved in the 70s. So it was very easy for us to get that back up and running again, whereas they were doing it from scratch. And if something is going to change the strategic balance that extremely, and the Russians know they can't keep up in the financial fight, you know they're going to be screaming for arms control because that's the only way they can achieve parity. So let's start with the health. The Russians, I don't want to say they're all alcoholics or anything like that, but you can buy shots of vodka in the subway to keep you warm on a winter morning from a little old lady that's just right there at the door. So the idea that vodka solves all harms is definitely ingrained into the society. In a long winter, low sun climate like Russia, there are not a huge amount of vegetables and fruits in their diets, a lot of saturated fats, and a lot of heroin. In per capita terms, Russia is probably the second most addicted country in the world. And because the bottom fell out of the healthcare system post-Soviet, they also have the highest tuberculosis rates in the world. Probably 1 in 4 Russians carry the TB bacterium.
Whoa.
in Bacillus form. And it's not the TB that we know here in the United States. It's multi-drug resistant. So you're talking about needing 2 years of antibiotics at the cost of several $1,000s a person to get off of it. And they just don't have the income for that. HIV, they used to be one of the most infected countries in the world, and then they stopped collecting data. So we haven't had a good update on that in 15 years. But at that time, it would look like the people of reproductive age, upwards of a fifth of the population may have been exposed, but we really just don't know. Education. So in the 1980s, especially after 1983, the Russians were facing a simultaneous strategic and financial crunch. And the only way they could make the strategic picture work was by having some sort of peace with the United States. They had outspent themselves for 30 years. And so they were flat broke. And because you don't just go from, that is my ideological foe, that's the country that's been threatening me with nuclear weapons for 50 years, to, yeah, we can talk now. You don't do that in a year. It took two premiers dying of old age before they could finally make that offer. So in the meantime, they just tried to spend their way out of their strategic imbroglio, and it didn't work. It bankrupted them. And so they had to figure out where to cut. Well, they couldn't cut the military because they weren't really ready to make peace. They couldn't cut the nuclear facilities because they weren't ready to make peace. They couldn't cut their oil and natural gas production because that was their only source of income. So they cut education. In Russia, the educational system is different from here. So here, you go to high school, you go to college, maybe you go to grad school, you enter the workforce, and you're earning money from day one, hopefully.
Well, you picked up a couple $100,000 worth of debt along the way, but whatever. That's beyond the point.
But in Russia, there was a technical training that was done in their high schools that is not done in the United States as a rule. And then you become an apprentice. And you have an apprenticeship for 4, 5, 6 years before you go on and get your grown-up job of being an accountant or an engineer or whatever it happened to be. Well, the high school technical training collapsed around 1985. That's when all these cuts happened, just as Gorbachev was coming to power, which meant that there was no one that could be taken as an apprentice right out of high school. You would have to train them up additionally. And so the labor force got very thin, and the educational system was never repaired. And you had the post-Soviet collapse where pretty much everything was canceled. And you fast forward to now, and the youngest group of people who have had that technical training and had a good apprenticeship and actually had a real adult job, they're in their late 50s. And it's far too late at this point to regenerate that. They've tried a couple of times with hiccups here and there. It's never really stuck because it was never for more than a small subsector like software coding or a very specific group of people like friends of Putin's kids. And as long as that's been the situation, you're not getting the millions of new workers that are skilled that you need every single year. 2 million workers also moved out in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. They were all young and they were all skilled. And we've probably had about 250,000 Russians flee so far during the Ukraine war, which again, were young and skilled, and they were absolutely irreplaceable. So, you fast forward just a year or 3, and we're talking about the Russians having to make some very real choices about what to let drop. Oil and natural gas, food production, the military component, the strategic missile forces. They can't keep all of these things up and running. And I don't want to overanalyze this because we just don't have very good information. We're only in week 3 of the war.
Right.
There's a case to be made that their military commanders are something they decided to let drop, in which case that was probably the wrong thing at this time. But we've seen an Iraqi level of military coordination and logistics in the war so far. It's abysmal. It's underperformed what every analyst I have spoken with has ever guessed the Russians were capable of.